Do you think that have you heard much actually about false flags? Like there was the Saudi Arabia, apparently Saudi Aramco, Iran says they didn't hit that,
Yeah,
saying that it was probably
right. We
Israel.
talked about that.
There was a
And
drone
that,
into Azerbaijan. There was a
yeah,
drone in Cyprus, and
right, right. I think those are probably are false flags. I'm not a guy to jump on that bandwagon very quickly, but I think that's what they are. These Iranians have no reason, like to send a drone into Azerbaijan or a missile into Turkey. I mean, there's always a chance that something malfunctioned, and but it's also very, very believable that it was a false flag. It was something, I think, especially in the case of Azerbaijan, and this is very worrying. Again, Azerbaijan, a nominally Muslim country, is very closely allied with Israel. Israel has a base there. And you know that, okay, when this drone went in, immediately the Iranians said, expressed uh, their condolences for those who were injured or killed, but they also denied that they had anything to do with it immediately. And I think they clearly they didn't. And it's interesting, like the Turks made a statement that kind of indirectly supported the Iranians, but the Azerbaijanis, Aliyev, the basically the dictator there, immediately seized on this and denounced the Iranians and started moving all kinds of military assets right to the border. And so there's a real risk that this was set up, as an excuse for an invasion of Iran, from Azerbaijan. This is he's probably being pressured by both the Americans and the Israelis to do this. And then we've seen similar things. There's been a lot of contradictory reports about what's happening in Iraqi Kurdistan. You say that there are Kurds there are organizing, are preparing to invade. There actually have been reports that there have been incursions or an attempted invasion. I think there may have actually been an incursion, but it was repulsed, that they're going to try to take that territory that's inhabited by Iranian Kurds. So, again, Iran is a very ethnically diverse country. About 10% of Iranians are actually Kurds, and about 20% are Azeris, that are belong to the same ethnic group that you find in Azerbaijan. So this is something that we may see, and that's going to create a real headache for the Iranians. And then I'm sure if there's a ground incursion, the U.S. and the Israel will provide air support. So it could create real difficulties for the Iranians. We'll see.
seems like we are always using the Kurds. You think the Kurds would
Yeah.
get tired of being used? It seems like they always
Right.
get thrown under the bus at the end of
Yeah.
the day, again and again and again by us. So it's Iraq, Syria, wherever, and then you're going to piss off the Turks as well.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
keep
yeah.
doing
So
this.
there are countervailing forces, especially in the case of the Kurds. I think that's very important to point out. Right, because the Turks do not want to see a Kurdistan established. They do not want to see an independent Kurdish state. And so there is a chance that, like, if that really looks like it's starting to take place, they might intervene and attack the Kurds. A very good chance of that. We know they're hypersensitive about Kurdish independence or, the establishment of any kind of Kurdistan. Yeah, but it would be just incredibly stupid on the parts of the Kurds to do it. They were betrayed in Syria. Everybody saw it coming, apparently, except for the Kurds themselves. They were betrayed in Syria we're talking about a few weeks ago. So are they going to do this? Maybe they're that stupid. They just have hotheads that believe what they're told. Yeah, I would be more worried about the Azeris. On the other hand, it's these groups are very well integrated within. They are ethnic Azeris and ethnic Kurds, but they have been part of Iran for centuries, is my understanding. It's not like so they do have an Azeri identity or Kurdish identity, but they do have a real Iranian identity. That's not something that has just been, imposed on them recently. And the president of Iran is, my understanding is he's Azeri, or at least part Azeri, Pezeshkian. And that's not unusual. I think even the Ayatollah, there's just many people in the leadership have are either belong to these different ethnic minorities or have parents or grandparents that belong to these ethnic minorities. So it's not clear that they can actually get any sort of uprising to occur. I'm sure you can find some separatists within these regions to work with the invading forces, but I think the majority of the population will, stand with Iran. But that may change over time if everybody starts to suffer at some point. People's allegiances will break down under long-term suffering. But I think we're a long, long ways from that.
Yeah. Do you see Turkey getting more involved? Because Turkey is quite a military power.
Yeah.
They could really sway the balance of things.
It's not impossible. Well, again, if the Kurds become involved, I think the Turks probably would become involved. I think that would be a real trigger for them. Would they actually help? Again, they are a member of NATO, and their relations with Iran are not really very good, I think, especially after the fall of Syria. But on the other hand, I think they do not want to see Iran actually fall, because they understand that they would be like the next, let's say, dish on the table. If Iran goes, then like the one remaining power that can actually oppose Israel in a significant way is Turkey. They would be, and then there's already been talk among the Israelis. Certain Israeli officials will say, yeah, it's going to be Turkey next or something, and I'm sure the Turks are aware they don't want to do that.
The Israelis are so crazy to even be voicing that at this stage, and the fact that you said like 90% of Jewish Israelis are for this war with Iran, even though they're getting hit hard, and the United States, it's obviously not a popular war here, but we also don't have the danger of being overrun. Israel does. They have a war breaking out in Lebanon that could descend into a civil war that could easily start to spill over into them. You have Egypt right below where everybody's upset. Who knows how long Sisi can stay in power if things start, as this progresses. And then same thing with Jordan. It's a majority Palestinian population, that are being ruled under this Jordanian king that is just being bought off by the US. As this continues, like Israel's in real danger of it. They lose control, and then all of a sudden it's like it spills right into their country. They're not in a safe place. I just don't understand why they're so gung-ho for this when we're looking at what I see is almost the inevitable destruction of their country through this war.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there is a kind of a deep abiding faith in the IDF within Israel that crosses the political spectrum. And even when people hate Netanyahu, when the IDF goes to war, they support the IDF. I think that's a big part of it. And then it just in general, Israel has, not just the leadership, but the people as a whole has decided that that the only solution, the only way to gain security is through military action. It's just like that's where we need to be feared, above all. That used to be, that's actually always been voiced, at least within, certain parts of the political class in Israel, certainly going back to the early Zionists. We need to be feared above all. But that has become the thinking, I think, of all Israelis. And so the more death and destruction that we deal to the people around us, the more they'll fear us and the safer we'll be.
The more they hate you.
I know. It's just like eventually, though, you just overplay your hand. I don't know if this will be the time or it'll be sometime in the future, but eventually you overplay your hand and you have made, just bitter enemies of everyone around you. In the end, that's not good for your security. You may be able to keep them down for a while, but eventually you won't. You'll lose control, and then it's going to be very, very bad for you.
Right. We've talked many times about where this war will go, and I often say that I think it's going to go nuclear. Do you think that we're being a bit dramatic about the risk of nukes in this situation where we are now, or is it,
Yeah, I don't think it will go nuclear, but there is a risk that it will go nuclear, and it's a non-negligible risk. Again, it's just that this is a poorly thought out war. The other side has shown that it can actually fight back. These are two powers that are just have kind of developed this, well, a sense of invincibility, and it's that, or an aura of invincibility, which is very, very important for them to maintain. So even if we're not talking about a real existential threat, if it looks like they're losing that aura of invincibility, they will be tempted to go nuclear. It's like I don't know that they will. Because there are real consequences, that even these crazies are aware of. But there is a risk. And so I think we have to talk about it, because it's such a horrible thing that even if we're talking about 1%, 1% is way, way too high, And I think there's at least a 1% chance, maybe, but I think probably more than that this could end up being nuclear. I'm not going to put an exact number on it, but it's non-negligible. And so we need to talk about it.
Right. And we have to talk about it because what we're seeing is the U.S. immediately go to this carpet bombing type of campaign. But what else can they do? You can't win a war this way. Will they do boots on the ground? There's been talk about that.
Right.
And that's the only, I'm just trying to think about the steps of the escalation ladder, because we would, when we were watching the Ukraine war, we could see it kind of escalate step by step by step. Here with the Iran war, it's just going straight to the top. And then you're like, okay, well, what else can the U.S. do here? It seems like they're doing everything they can short of boots on the ground and nuclear weapons. Am I missing something? I'm not even so sure what our Navy is really doing, because it sounds like it keeps on getting close and then running away.
Yeah, right. We don't know. The Iranians say that with their missiles, and drones, they chased the USS Abraham Lincoln to more than 1,000 kilometers away, where it's going to be much less effective. It means that shorter sorties and, fewer sorties. I don't know. That hasn't been confirmed. It may or may not be true. But then there is this talk. There's been talk, like you say, about boots on the ground. The Pentagon, I guess Hegseth and Trump won't rule that out. I think they'd be very reluctant to do it. But if things go, see, the thing is, when you go into a war and, you have your plan A, you think that this is going to work out one way, it doesn't. And then you find yourself in a war, with the chance of a real defeat, and you start to consider options that you didn't want to consider before. That's what happens in war. Unfortunately, that's what happens. And you start to do things that you had forsworn in the past. There's no way I'm going to do that. That would be suicide, or that would just have such horrible consequences. But then you start to realize, man, I'm going to lose this war unless I try this or that. We've got it. You go up the escalation ladder. And so we could go to boots on the ground. I think they're going to probably try to convince like Azerbaijan to do that for them. And the Kurds, the hapless Kurds. Another thing they're talking about is providing escorts, naval escorts for tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. But that just seems so foolish. The Iranians would just jump for joy if they heard that they just decided to do that, because, it's really hard to hit your ships when they're hundreds of kilometers off the coast. And, maybe we don't have the ability, or only if we get lucky, we'll hit one. But if you take them through the Strait of Hormuz, those ships are going to be in visual range, and they just have, that whole coastline is Iranian, and they have, both at the Strait and on the Persian Gulf side and the Gulf of Oman side for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. And they have all kinds of short range missiles and drones that can very easily hit a ship that traveling through that strait or approaching the strait. That would be extraordinarily foolish. I think the Navy is just going to say no.
I think they already did. I think they already did. I think Trump said that, and the U.S. Navy is like, yeah, no, that's not happening. We can't do that. So
we'll see. But if he makes a direct order, they may go ahead and do it. If he insists against their advice. But that would be, again, chalk one up for the Iranians. The Iranians would say, okay, good. We get to sink some U.S. naval vessels.